All right, so I hope everyone enjoyed lunch. We're going to go ahead and get started. So the second half of the day today is really going to be focused on, I think, some of our most challenging and probably least favorite topics, but they're obviously necessities for operationalizing new technologies, and that's around security, compliance, and governance. There are hard conversations to have, and especially when you're bringing emerging technologies into into an operational environment. There's a lot of wood to chop, a lot of effort needs to be put into that. So hopefully we'll be able to provide some insight into how that's being done currently with containers across the federal space. So I'd like to kick it off by bringing up Aidan to the stage. Aidan Feldman is an engineer at 18F, and he works to improve DevOps and security and compliance for federal processes. So with that, bring him on.
All right. Thank you very much for having me. As was mentioned, I'm Aidan Feldman. I'm at 18F, which is housed within the General Services Administration. We work to improve the user experience of government. A lot of my work happens to be of improving the user experience of government for itself. So as a lot of you probably know, it's not a lot of fun to go through things like compliance and procurement, et cetera. That's the kind of stuff I'm working on. I kind of work for David Shive, who you saw at the beginning. So if you see him, please tell him I did a good job. The other talks today are a lot about all the cool stuff you can do with containers, slick demos, showing a hello world in minutes, et cetera. I'm here to bring it down a bit and dampen the mood. This talk is about beauty and pain. So with apologies to Shakespeare and Lord Tennyson, containers, shall I compare thee to a server's bay? Thou art now all the rage and lighter weight. Compliance shakes the buds of the beltway, but from an image one can recreate. There's more where that came from. So why do governments like containers? Well, there's a bunch of reasons, and you've probably heard some of these already. There's things like vendor independence and portability, right? You can write it once, deploy anywhere, right? That's the slogan. Dependency isolation, right? Everything that you need is contained within that little Docker file or specification that says exactly what's going to be packaged with your system, and people can look at that and understand exactly what's going into it. There is auditability. That includes things like the dependency specification I just mentioned and the configuration as code that follows from that, right? It's a lot harder to work around it in a containerized world. And so it enforces those best practices that probably you should be doing anyway. And then the immutability, right, from build to deploy. Because of that immutability, there's also the ease of recovery, right? Container dies, I can just restart another one, et cetera. So the decision tree seems somewhat simple, right? Do we want to use containers? Yes. It's love at first sight, right? But where are we really at? I couldn't find really great numbers on container usage in government, but I think we can get somewhere close to an approximation. So to start with, 93% of all organizations, not limited to public sector, are currently using cloud services. Now, that number drops down to 47% of government organizations actively using cloud services. Right, and I think we could debate about that number, but let's just say it's true. Going back to all organizations, about 25% are using containers at some stage of deployment, not even necessarily production. So using these three numbers, we can derive that from the 25% and the 93 using cloud, that ratio, that we get to, let's say, 13% of government using containers. I think that's generous, actually. But it gives you an idea, right? It's not very high, and there's probably really good reasons for this, and let's talk about what some of those might be. So the decision framework goes from something like this to something a bit more like this. Love is complicated. These simplified steps, right? This masks a lot of complexity, I think. These simplified steps are a really good reason that might prevent adoption of containers and other modern technologies in the public sector. So your software in the cloud, they may not fit. For the restrictions imposed, might do physical hardware commit. Problem 1, container friendliness. So container unfriendly software can take many forms. It might, for example, expect to be long running, right? You can't really restart it, or you have to go in with a blowtorch and fix stuff. It might only expect to be running on a single host instance, right? You can't have high availability. You can't have containers replacing each other without downtime because of licensing restrictions or these other things. It might expect a fixed IP or MAC address, right? So that doesn't really work where a container might just be, should be able to run anywhere, right? That's very strongly limiting the portability even within a single environment. Beyond that, your software might require manual installation steps or activation or deactivation, right? We had a piece of software we were using where anytime you wanted to register a new instance of the thing, you had to email their support and get that thing registered. That definitely does not work for a containerized or even more traditional cloud environment. So once containerized, doth your app reside floating in space, or for one to decide what host, what memory, the network in place to direct traffic, save hassle, save space. That brings us to management. So once your app is containerized, what do you do? For starters, local development can be tough, right? Troubleshooting becomes more difficult. You have another layer to work through where problems can occur. No comment on the quality. Docker has worked fine for me, or other container technologies have worked fine for me, but it is another layer to learn and understand. You might have to buy that other layer, right? Either for development or for production use, because you will need something like an orchestrator. Once having a container, you might want to deploy it in production. When you do that, you need to integrate different pieces, right? Your logging pieces and your monitoring, et cetera, and have that management on top, right? To handle things like resource allocation and restarting your app if it crashes, et cetera. And this is where an orchestrator might need to come in. So that monitoring and vulnerability scanning and logging, that now not only has to be done on your host, because your security team will probably still care about that, but you also have to do it at your container level. So now you have 6 problems instead of 3. Procurement can add months to the project, et cetera. All of this can really bog you down. I hold it true. Whatever befall, I feel it when I sorrow most. Better to mire in ATO than never modernize at all.
I'm just going to clap again.
Thank you. Compliance. This brings us to the big one. So development environments can be hard to come by, right? Okay, we've picked a technology we want to use. Cool, I want to try it out. Oh, sorry, your machine's locked down. You can't install anything because this is government. So that requires review and approval processes and going through your help desk, et cetera, right? That can be a long cycle to even get to being able to start the command just on your computer, much less being able to install it anywhere real, like a server. So that procurement, that setup, et cetera, can really block even starting to play with the technology. Beyond that, containers and these sorts of technologies are going to be new to a lot of people who do assessment, right, for security of your applications. And this will be a challenge to help them understand, right? their job is there to make sure that you're doing things securely. If they don't understand what your system is doing, they can't do their jobs, right? So their intention is good, but the knowledge and experience of these technologies might not be there. So you're going to need to work with them. Getting containers through an ATO process with those containers can be tough, even if they are on your side, right? As I mentioned, you have the 6 problems instead of 3, needing to worry about logging, monitoring, et cetera, at multiple different layers now, right? And there are tools to do that, but again, you have to procure them, you have to integrate them, et cetera, and you have to purchase and integrate each one separately, right? Which everyone knows how much fun that can be. So you might want to use a managed container environment, right? So you don't have to set this all up yourself, get your hands dirty, et cetera. Because why would you want to take that burden on yourself if you don't have to? But there are very few managed container environments authorized for government use. And so the onus is going to be on your agency, if you're inside of an agency, or working with the agency if you're a contractor, to get that environment authorized, right? So even ones that give a lot out of the box, right, it's going to take a while to get that approval. Relationships are hard. I've painted a pretty bleak picture of how these relationships can go. But where do we go from here? How can this love be saved? So there is some good news. There are secure ways to run containers, including ones that are FedRAMPed. And therefore likely easier to get approval for in your agency. Containers are being used in government, right? 18F, my team, as well as others are running dozens of systems on cloud.gov today. And so that's an easy way. And there's many other vendors and other people from other agencies in the room, right, who I'm sure are also using containers. Can you just raise your hand if you're using containers in production? Okay, all right. About 13%. Good callback. But it is happening, right? It is not zero. And so that proves it can be done. And I'll get more to that in a second. You know, there were limitations around the technology in terms of what you can do. That's continually being broken down. So for example, Windows kernel support was added in Windows Server 2016. And so this enables a much broader swath of applications, especially in government where Windows use is really high, to be able to do these migrations. This is all worth doing because containers are preferable to servers. There are a lot of benefits that have been discussed in this talk and in others. Use them if you can. It is definitely better than the alternative. And you know, based on the attendance in this room and you know, the conversations that are happening, et cetera, interest and demand are clearly strong. So this is problems we need to solve. So to get more tactical, right, this is a sort of simplified version of what deploying might look like, right? You go from the source code of your system or the base installers, et cetera. You turn them into an image, and then you turn them into a container, right? Very basic. Beyond the orchestrator, you might need some other things on top of it. So this is something you're hopefully doing already, but just pointing it out if you're not, that you need to be doing vulnerability scanning on your source code itself, right? The source code probably has dependencies, right? If it's a Node.js application, through NPM dependencies, Java through Maven dependencies, et cetera, right? So that's just on the source code, no matter how you're deploying it. But with in a containerized world, right, you're going to have these images that are built, and you need to do vulnerability scanning there too, because you are encoding the packages and various things that are getting installed in those containers in your specification. And so you now need vulnerability scanning at 2 steps. The good news is, back in the day, or the current day for probably a lot of us, is that you don't know what's installed until you actually install it when you have a server that is not a container, right? And so you need to do runtime vulnerability scanning with containers, you get that frozen image, right, in the specification that builds it. And so there are tools that are represented by vendors here, including Docker, that do that scanning for you and will do static analysis on that image and on the layers within it. And so these will fulfill security controls like RA5. This is NIST controls if they don't sound familiar to you. And so that is looking at risk assessment. You need to make sure that you're not deploying vulnerable software, right? None of us want to be Equifax. From there, you might want to think about, instead of just deploying an image directly, right, using a registry that you own or that has some control around it, right? You might need audit controls in terms of controlling who will, knowing who pushed or pulled an image, et cetera. That also enforces things like configuration management, the CM controls, right? Ensuring that what you say you're deploying is actually what's going out. And there are a lot of products out there for that registry, including ones that have been talked about today. So then once you have the actual container live, you still need to do some runtime scanning, right? Because you want to look for things like malware and intrusion detection, et cetera. And so these will satisfy things like your auditing controls as well as things like SI4. And so there's all these different controls that map onto the containers and are things that you'd have to do in a different way than if you were just looking at like a raw operating system. So in that chain that we just saw, notice that a lot of those checks were being built into the process and are hopefully done through things like continuous integration, right? We're taking the humans out of that process because this is really tedious work. It's very important work, but it's very tedious work. And so we don't want someone to have to do that. They have better things to do with their time. And also, computers are going to be better at checking those things than we are. And so it allows you to, on top of all that, it allows you to be proactive rather than just doing a scan, say, once a month, right? The other tip I have for what we were just talking about is getting the security team involved early, right? And your compliance assessors, et cetera, right? And I don't mean just, here's what we're thinking about doing, like FYI, we'll be coming to you for an authority to operate in a few months. I mean actually getting them involved in design and getting them involved in code review, right? Like they should be a part of your team. And this is putting the sec in DevSecOps. So what's needed? From all of you, everyone in this room, we need to do more sharing of best practices, right? There's a lot of things happening at agencies and companies, et cetera, and the only communication is through sales, which is fine. That should happen, but there needs to be more discussion about how do you do running of a secure registry? How do you do the fulfilling of these various controls? Like, what are you patching together to make that happen, right? This can take the form of posts on mailing lists. This can take the form of blog posts or case studies, either on your site or partnering as a guest poster on someone else's. Or, maybe best of all, open source code, right? This should not be secret. So we need more help on the inside as well, right? This is my recruiting pitch, right? For those that aren't in government, vendors, we really appreciate you, but vendors and contractors can only really be effective when there are good people on the inside. So if you're not on the inside, consider being on the inside. And then from there, we need our tools and our platforms to be secure by default, right? It shouldn't take a lot of work to go from, okay, I bought this thing, I unwrapped it, took it out of the box, and now it's going to take me months to get it configured to a way that is secure enough to pass assessment, right? It should just do that out of the box. And so vendors, I hope you are thinking in that sort of way, doing convention over configuration, especially when it comes to security. In other words, don't make me think. So I forgot to actually make a slide for this, but it might be the most important point of all, which is the cloud is not a virtue. I'm going to say it again. The cloud is not a virtue, and neither are containers. Containers and the cloud are a way to increase speed to deployment and releasing changes. It's a way to increase security and auditability, scalability, availability, and empowering teams, right? The cloud, containers, et cetera, those are all just implementation details, and they're the best we have right now. So, from the vendors in the room specifically, we need more turnkey solutions, right? Especially on the compliance side. We need services to be more easily auditable, right? That has to be a first-class consideration when building these tools. Not only do we need those features in place, but we also need documentation explaining how those and the existing features relate to compliance, right? Do the work for your customers of explaining how this meets their compliance needs. Literally document the security controls for them. So just to give you an example, this is the cloud.gov documentation. Cloud.gov is a product of 18F. And this is the documentation about the how to retrieve the auditing events, right? And it actually talks about the control families in there. Similarly, Docker has a list of controls with descriptions of how Docker Enterprise or Trusted Registry or whatever fulfills that control. You can copy and paste this into your system security plan. They're saving you work. Other vendors, please start to think more in this vein, right? It's not enough to solve the problems with technology. You also need to speak to the compliance side. Side note, this site is built using Open Control. There's a session about OSCAL right now or after. Anyway, Open Control and OSCAL are sort of sister projects that think about compliance documentation in a structured format. Come and find me or Andrew Weiss afterwards if you want to talk about them, or go to the OSCAL talk. But that helps enable a lot of this work as well. Love is a smoke raised with the fume of sighs, being purged, a fire sparkling in lovers' eyes, being vexed, a sea nourished with lovers' tears. What is it else? A madness most discreet, a choking gall and a preserving sweet. So too are containers, a challenge to meet. Merci.